I'm Professor Kenneth Hansen of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program, and I'd like to share, with a little help from AI, some important insight about the most horrific genocide in all of human history, the Shoah, otherwise known as the Holocaust. When we talk about the Jewish people during the Holocaust, we're talking about a people whose will was by no means crushed. We're talking about a people with a long history of self-governance that even the Nazis recognized and tried to work with. In fact, the Nazis decided early on that it was in their interest to use Jewish self-governing organizations to their advantage. From their standpoint, it was important to have some Jewish representative bodies to whom they could give orders. American Jews, for their part, wanted to provide assistance in some way to German Jews, and they wanted some organizations to help coordinate such assistance. Following Kristallnacht in November 1938, all autonomous Jewish organizations were abolished, except for emigration. Interestingly, the Germans were still more than willing to let Jews leave. The trouble was, very few destinations were willing to receive them. And for all those remaining within the Reich, the Nazis realized that they still needed Jewish organizations to act in an intermediary capacity with the German government. Bear in mind, when the Nazis first occupied Poland in 1939, they had no official policy toward Jews. There was as yet no formal decision regarding mass murder. What were they to do with an additional 1.7 million Jews in Poland? Some Nazis favored pushing them into Russia. But of course, they must first seize their valuables. In July 1939, the government issued an order disbanding the Reichsvertretung der Deutschen Juden, the national representation of German Jews, which the Jews had voluntarily organized. But in its place, they established the Reichsvereinigung der Juden in Deutschland, the National Association of Jews in Germany. This was a compulsory organization of all Jews, as defined by the 1935 Nuremberg Laws. On September 30th, 1939, at a meeting of police chiefs, Reinhard Heydrich spoke in the name of Himmler and Hitler, declaring that a submissive Jewish representation was needed in order to handle the details of their expulsion and the expropriation of their property. In the following year, July of 1940, a trial balloon was floated, known as the Madagascar Plan. Franz Rademacher, head of the department in charge of Jewish affairs, declared,
"The approaching victory gives Germany the possibility and the duty of solving the Jewish question in Europe. The desirable solution is all Jews out of Europe. The task of the Foreign Ministry in this is A. To include this demand in the peace treaty. B. To secure the territory necessary for the settlement of the Jews in the peace treaty. C. To determine the position under international law of the new Jewish overseas settlement. In the peace treaty, France must make the island of Madagascar available for the solution of the Jewish question, and to resettle and compensate the approximately 25,000 French citizens living there. The island will be transferred to Germany under a mandate. The Jews will have their own administration in this territory, their own mayors, police, postal and railroad administration. The Jews will be jointly liable for the value of the island. For this purpose, their former European financial assets will be transferred for use to a European bank to be established for this purpose. Insofar as the assets are not sufficient to pay for the land which they will receive, and for the purchase of necessary commodities in Europe for the development of the island, the Jews will be able to receive bank credits from the same bank. As Madagascar will only be a mandate, the Jews living there will not acquire German citizenship. On the other hand, the Jews deported to Madagascar will lose their citizenship of European countries from the date of deportation. Instead, they will become residents of the Mandate of Madagascar. This arrangement would prevent the possible establishment in Palestine by the Jews of a Vatican state of their own, and the opportunity for them to exploit for their own purposes the symbolic importance which Jerusalem has for the Christian and Mohammedan parts of the world. Moreover, the Jews will remain in German hands as a pledge for the future good behavior of the members of their race in America.
Notice that the idea of a Jewish autonomous government is written into the document, and that it was to be used as a pretext for seizing Jewish property. The plan was abandoned in the end, and the Nazis had to find some other way to accomplish the same ends. They decided to double down on the Judenrate, Jewish councils of 24 men for large Jewish communities, 12 for smaller ones. Former Jewish community leaders were put in charge, often a rabbi. The first Judenrat had already been established in 1939, the last in 1943. The notorious Jewish ghettos were only established in certain cities, none on German soil. But the Judenrate were established immediately and everywhere. A document from Hans Frank, governor of the occupied Polish territories, dated November 28, 1939, defines the establishment of the Judenrate.
In each community, a body representing the Jews will be formed. This representation of the Jews, known as the Judenrat, will consist of 12 Jews in communities with up to 10,000 inhabitants, and in communities with more than 10,000 inhabitants, of 24 Jews, drawn from the locally resident population. The Judenrat will be elected by the Jews of the community. It is the duty of the Judenrat, through its chairman or his deputy, to receive the orders of the German administration. It is responsible for the conscientious carrying out of orders to their full extent. The directives it issues to carry out these German decrees must be obeyed by all Jews and Jewesses.
There were only a few exceptions to these requirements. In Lodz, there was no Judenrat, only one leader with a small advisory council. In Vilna, the Judenrat was officially dissolved in 1942, after which one man, Jacob Gens, became a Judenrat all by himself. Known as the Commander and Jacob I, he issued a call to the ghetto inhabitants, reiterating his credo.
The basis for the existence of the ghetto is labor, law and order. Every ghetto inhabitant who is capable of working must do so, for that is the cornerstone of our lives.
Nonetheless, throughout 1942, the ghetto inhabitants attended theater and went to lectures on scientific topics, and Gens actively supported all such cultural activities. How do we evaluate the Judenrat leaders? Were they brave men trying to do their best for their beleaguered communities? Or should we consider them collaborators with the Nazis? Holocaust scholar Raoul Hilberg has argued that the moment the Nazis nominated Jewish leaders, they became part of the murder machinery. For example, in one Lithuanian town, there was a Judenrat that tried to start a hospital in the ghetto, but the Jews treated there were only returned to slave labor. A contrary view has been advanced by Aaron Weiss and Yehuda Bauer.
This analysis is based on the results of Nazi policy, namely mass murder, but we cannot judge intent by results. Why was the hospital established in that Lithuanian town? To keep the people alive as long as possible in the hope of being liberated. The Jews there, as everywhere, had very limited knowledge about the final aims of Nazis. They could only do what they felt was helpful at that moment.
Returning to the Lodz ghetto, we should point out that it was the only hermetically sealed ghetto. The inhabitants were tasked with making boots for the German army, and for that reason it was left alone until 1944, longer than any other. The local head of the Judenrat, Mordechai Chaim Romkowski, considered a brutal dictator, established a slave labor system. He rationalized that he was willing to sacrifice some in order to save others. Was he a horrible collaborator with the Nazi murderers? Perhaps. But as a result, the Germans postponed liquidation of the ghetto until 1944. The most poignant moment in the history of the ghetto occurred at the end of 1941, when the Chełmno extermination camp was completed and Romkowski was forced to organize the deportations of part of the Jewish population, ostensibly for resettlement elsewhere. He and his staff had to decide who was to be deported. Bear in mind, rabbis in the ghetto were debating all of this, citing the Jerusalem Talmud, Tractate Trumot, Chapter 8.
If a group of Jews are surrounded by bandits, who demand, "Give over one of you for us to kill, or we will murder you all," they should all allow themselves to be killed rather than to give up even one Jewish soul.
Nonetheless, in an address delivered in Yiddish at a hastily called public meeting on September 4th, 1942, at a central square in the ghetto, before an assembly of several thousand, Romkowski was recorded as saying,
"The ghetto has been struck a hard blow. They demand what is most dear to it, children and old people. I was not privileged to have a child of my own and therefore devoted my best years to children. I lived and breathed together with children. I never imagined that my own hands would be forced to make this sacrifice on the altar. In my old age I am forced to stretch out my hands and to beg, brothers and sisters, give them to me. Fathers and mothers, give me your children." Yesterday, in the course of the day, I was given the order to send away more than 20,000 Jews from the ghetto, and if I did not, we will do it ourselves. The question arose, should we have accepted this and carried it out ourselves, or left it to others? But as we were guided not by the thought, how many will be lost, but how many can be saved, we arrived at the conclusion that however difficult it was going to be, we must take upon ourselves the carrying out of this decree. I must carry out this difficult and bloody operation. I must cut off limbs in order to save the body. I must take away children, and if I do not, others too will be taken, God forbid. I understand what it means to tear off a part of the body. Yesterday, I begged on my knees, but it did not work. From small villages with Jewish populations of 7,000 to 8,000, barely 1,000 arrived here. So which is better? What do you want? That 80,000 to 90,000 Jews remain, or God forbid, that the whole population be annihilated. One needs the heart of a bandit to ask from you what I am asking. But put yourself in my place, think logically, and you'll reach the conclusion that I cannot proceed any other way. The part that can be saved is much larger than the part that must be given away.
How do we judge Mordechai Chaim Romkowski? Tyrant? Collaborator? There is no easy answer. Here's what we do know. In July 1944, the Soviet army, advancing rapidly through Poland, stopped about 75 miles from Lodz. In August, the Nazis sent Romkowski and most of the ghetto inhabitants to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When the Soviets overran the German army and covered the distance to Lodz in 3 days in January 1945, they found 870 survivors. Had the Soviets continued their July 1944 offensive for another 75 miles, they might have liberated 69,000 Jews. Would Romkowski have been vindicated at a post-war trial for saving their lives? Or would he have been condemned as the murderer of tens of thousands of others? The opposite of collaboration might be seen in the city of Minsk, where Leah Mishkin, who had been born in Minsk and was a middle-grade local government official before the war, was appointed Judenrate leader. 2 underground movements were organized, one in the ghetto under Hirsch Smolyar and one in the city of Minsk. At the end of 1941, the first group of armed ghetto Jews left for the forests. Their exit and the later exit of thousands of others resulted from the cooperation of the Judenrate with the underground. On November 7th and November 20th, 1941, 20,000 Jews were murdered. The Germans, not the Judenrate, ordered the Jews to concentrate in the central square. Mishkin was arrested in February 1942 for hiding an anti-Nazi German officer who then betrayed him. He was executed in March. The bottom line, most Judenrate were organized along the same lines and with one purpose, to execute Nazi policies. Both the leaders and the captive populations had little choice but to cooperate, either that or be killed. Each hell was different, and who among us can sit in judgment?